So I usually like to start by giving you all sort of a quick overview of what I was aiming to do with my memoir. And I should actually even first start it in a certain ironic way. The very origin of this book is here in Maine. So I grew up in Baltimore, and I was at the time living in New York City, and I thought I had had this wild experience working for Rolling Stone and then organizing concerts. And I thought, I'm going to go off and write the great American novel. And I wound up in Hancock Point, Maine, and I went for 2 months, and I stayed about 5 months. I tried to move to Maine back then, but it didn't quite work out. Anyway, I wrote this absolutely, absolutely horrible book. It is to this day still in my garage in a cardboard box. So anyway, many years later, may have been quite close to the time I moved up here, about 14 years ago. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, all these experiences I had in New York City and organizing these No Nukes concerts and all of this stuff, I think there could be a book there. But, you know, as life, you never plan your life out. You know, I mean, if I could write my memoir fictionally, I wouldn't have some of the stuff in it. And the key thing I wouldn't have in it is that, quite sadly, my brother, older brother, took his life in 1990. And it was particularly hard because he was such a charismatic person, and he had a lot going for him. He appeared to be quite happily married with these 2 beautiful children. And so anyway, as I'm working on this book here in Maine now, again, but more like 12, 13, 14 years ago, he was in the book, but he was a very small part of the book. And when I started sending the book out to agents, one in particular said, look, you know, you got a good story here. It's enjoyable to read. It's all fun, but you've got your brother in it. And he's a force in your book that I think you have to develop. I think you really need to work on putting him more front and center in your book. And I thought about it, and I realized, you know, that there was a lot of stuff in the book that was probably unnecessary. But what I had to come to grips with was, why did my brother take his life? Like, why? And I didn't know. And, you know, I've had conversations, both my parents were alive when he took his life. Obviously, he had a wife. And, you know, I had conversations over the years with all of them, but I never felt like I really understood it. And, you know, when I thought about it, I thought, well, I'm going to really go into this. I'm going to really examine what might have happened. And, you know, part of why the book is called Brilliant Disguise is, as I went back through my brother's life, he took his life at 39. When I went back to our childhood, he was 3 years older. When I went back to our childhood, and I could trace all these very strange things that would happen. You know, there was a point when he was a lifeguard, and somehow he drank in the chlorine. My brother was very good with dogs, but at one point he sort of got attacked by a dog. And there were things over the years. There was also, and it is all in the memoir, but there were incidents too, a little bit closer to when he actually took his life, that were particularly, in retrospect, totally a cry for help, but nobody really understood it. You know, it was, and what would happen, he at the time was running his own shirt factory that my dad had kind of set him up in business, and he wound up in the hospital with rat poison. And of course, the public health officials went in, nobody else in the factory got sick. And in the hospital, officials went in, public health officials went in, and they questioned him, and they walked out and they said he didn't do it. You know, his best friend was a doctor, and, you know, he was going, he didn't do it. And it was all um, he would be fine. He was happy-go-lucky, and happy-go-lucky probably isn't exactly the right word. So anyway, I really focused on it, and what I started to realize was there was something that was coming to light around the time I was doing this, actually right before, but it was getting more popular, this whole idea of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. And there's been books written about it, and there was a very extensive study on ACEs. And the whole concept is that children who live through difficult situations may seem fine in childhood, but as they become adults, the trauma of what occurred early in their lives starts to peak out in sometimes very dangerous ways. So I did a lot of reading on that. I also found a really great therapist. She was here in Rockland, actually. And I saw her for a few years, and she was very helpful in helping me understand that what we went through as children. My father had been a successful Baltimore attorney, and when I was 3 and my brother was 6, he had invested a client's money, and it was not done properly, and the charge on my father was embezzlement. He wound up being disbarred. He would have gone to jail, but at the time my grandfather was able to bail him out. But it led to a very, very messy divorce. It meant, our entire home was broken apart. My brother and my mother went to live with my grandmother, and this was the mid-1950s, and there was no sense of what's the impact on the children. So, there was no effort to, I think things were even said in front of us that I don't think nowadays, in our current consciousness, I don't think we would ever say such things in front of our children. But, and we were so young, and the more I delved into it, the more it's like, of course. But what still amazes me is how successfully Robert seemingly lived his life. Whereas, it's sad for me as his only sibling to realize how much pain he was really in. So anyway, so I do weave together the two stories. So I still have the rock and roll in the story, and part of what I was trying to get at, my odyssey in terms of Rolling Stone, and then putting together these concerts, 5 nights in Madison Square Garden, and then the sort of craziness at the end of it. I feel in some ways that was my own reaction to my childhood trauma, since I also went through the trauma, but I was 3, he was 6, so plus I think it's father-son would have been a little more painful. So anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this and take questions, but I do want to read a couple sections from the book to so in weaving together the two stories, it does not go chronologically. So I weave the stories together, which I feel works. Anyway, so I'm going to start out with something about my brother. Oh, and this was, my brother was a very, very good student in high school. He was also an athlete. So when it came to applying to colleges, he got accepted pretty much everywhere he went, everywhere he applied. And Penn State wound up offering, I think, a wrestling scholarship. And my father at the time was living in Harrisburg. And my father kind of bribed him with, like, I'll buy you a car if you choose Penn State. Anyway, so then, though, his first year in college, after being a straight A student all through elementary and high school, his first year of college, he flunked out. So I had gone to visit him in Penn State with his girlfriend, and I thought it was great. I had a wonderful time. I would gladly have returned to Penn State, but Robert flunked out his first year. He had used the car Dad gave him to drive to drive back to Baltimore every chance he got to be with Faye, that was his girlfriend, and hardly ever went to classes. A crisis ensued, one requiring our father's presence in the apartment to talk directly with Mom. Robert had not yet returned home. A large looming figure, my dad made our tiny dining area look like a dollhouse miniature. How could this happen, he bellowed. He refused to sit down. I was supposed to disappear, but no spot in that tiny apartment took me out of earshot. Dad rattled off questions. Why didn't we know he was doing so poorly? Did he say anything to you? Nothing came in the mail? My distraught mother had no answers. They agreed Robert would have to come home, take summer classes, and start at the University of Maryland in the fall. Faye would be at College Park, so perhaps Robert got exactly what he wanted. Except, more likely, this uncharacteristic behavior was beyond his control. Doing so miserably at college after a stellar high school career signaled distress, even in an era marked by student dropouts and campus-wide strikes against the Vietnam War. Robert wasn't storming campus buildings or joining Washington-bound caravans. He was silently defying everyone's expectations of him, but no conversations occurred to try to determine what might be happening beneath the surface, how a lethal mix of emotions, bottled tight within him for more than a decade, had begun to steadily discharge. Okay, now I want, so getting hired at Rolling Stone for me was very odd because I know you're not going to believe this, but I'm really not very musically inclined. I mean, I thought Fleetwood Mac was a person. And somehow I got hired, which is all in the book. But, you know, I think that the person that was doing all the hiring, I mean, so many people had applied for the job. I mean, Rolling Stone was in the process of moving from San Francisco to New York, and they needed to build up their editorial staff. So they were interviewing so many people, and the woman that was doing all the interviewing, Iris, who was a fragile sort in a lot of ways, but, you know, I think they all came in and she was just, they all did the same thing. They all rattled off how much they knew about rock and roll and music and wanted to be rock and roll journalists and this and that. And then I walked in and I was just, you know, as far as she was concerned, I did anything but talk about music. And at the end of it, I think at the end of her interviewing people, she basically, well, the senior editor, I think it was actually the managing editor at that time, but he also interviewed me, and he wasn't really a rock and roll person. He was a film person, and I liked films, so I could talk to him about films. So the two of them hired me, which was great. It was a great experience. So here I'm sort of describing what it was like. This was after I'd only been there a short time. Want tickets to see Southside Johnny at the Bottom Line? Chuck asked me. Industry flacks often contacted him with press invites. Can I write a random note? If you hear something worth writing. I had been at the magazine for just over a month and had already learned I would have to be well positioned to grab a good quote. The crush of reporters had nearly knocked me over on a recent excursion with Michael to the Bottom Line to see Elvis Costello. Push them aside, Michael had yelled to me. You got a Rolling Stone press pass. I fought my way through until I was face to face with the singer, who had me directly in his sightlines behind his trademark black rimmed glasses. Ask a question, Michael prodded. In a shaky voice, I had asked, can you tell me the genesis of any of the songs on your new album? Elvis just stared at me. Michael leaped forward, playing tag team. He held a pen and pad firmly. Elvis, we're from Rolling Stone. We'd like to know who might have been the role model for Allison. A cashier at a local supermarket, the singer answered. She had a face that could have launched ships. Our 1 minute with Elvis was up, and Michael, kind Michael, had pulled me from disgrace. His save allowed me to retreat through the press horde without being the butt of ridicule. And Michael had grabbed a printable quote. I'm not sure I went to all that. Yeah, I guess I did go to a lot of concerts. Okay. So, how many of you remember who Gloria Emerson was? Gloria was she was certainly the first woman that got sent to cover combat duty. The New York Times sent her to Vietnam. And she was quite a character, but that'll come across in what I'm reading to you. She was great. Anyway, she was my mentor, by the way. Where's the toad? I never heard Gloria Emerson refer to Rolling Stone editor and publisher Jan Winter as anything but a squat amphibian with warts. If Jan ever, do you all know who Jan Winter was? Okay, is. If Jan ever heard the unflattering moniker, I'm certain he laughed. What rock has he hopped under? Tell me, I know he's hiding somewhere. Gloria could never slip into a room, not simply her towering 6-foot height, not just that the former war correspondent blurted anything on his mind, but because she refused to be ignored. Talking at a fast clip, she went on, I told him to stay away from my writers. And what does the toad do? I'll tell you, he takes poor Michael Hare into his office and sends him out so confused he doesn't know where he is. In his quest to conquer New York, Jan had courted Gloria after she published her National Book Award-winning Winners and Losers. Although it had nothing to do with rock and roll, her dramatic prose exposed raw emotions in people torn by war, much as the magazine sought to do in its long feature stories that wrung out the underside of contemporary culture. She agreed to edit the magazine's news and opinion section on the premise that she might bring serious politics and writers to a publication she had rarely read and often dismissed. Once situated in the Rolling Stone newsroom, Gloria became the eccentric aunt in a den of untamable ruffians. Gloria and Michael were part of a journalism cadre recently returned from Vietnam with enough literary muscle to forever change the way correspondents cover war. Their words and images so penetratingly sharp as to slice away the distance between reader and battle. While Gloria's book explored the psychological damage inflicted on both sides from the war, Michael's dispatches offered graphically vivid insights on war, battle, I'm sorry, I looked up, I shouldn't have, war, battle, and the human condition. The befuddled, soft-spoken man who had just walked out of Rolling Stone's offices bore little resemblance to the brittle, edgy narrator of dispatches, the memoir that John le Carré had declared the best book I have ever read on men and war in our time. Michael had smiled somewhat vacantly as he prepared to leave, tucked his papers under his arm, and then forgot they were there when he reached out to shake my hand. I helped him gather his things, and he thanked me profusely. But when Gloria couldn't find Jan, she pulled me into her office. I told the toad not to give Michael anything. She paced, lit a menthol cigarette, bunched her dark page boy hair with fidgety fingers. I tried to calm her. Maybe Jan gave him an assignment to get him back to writing. Oh, Pony, you're so naive. Michael needs much more than an assignment to write. I was Pony. Said with considerable affection, Gloria saw me as one of those Budweiser Clydesdales that pull heavy loads. Nearly twice my age, she grew to rely on me as someone who wouldn't falter, no matter how difficult the task. She had apparently forgotten that I would not join the Marines to do an expose as one of the first females to enlist. In fact, Gloria decided to mold me into a journalist. I did not know if I had the gumption to be a real reporter firing tough questions at powerful people. I always thought of myself as a fiction writer. I was in a program in college that guided me in that direction, but I'd written many short stories. But I wanted adventure, and this woman appeared ready to take me on one. Robert, had always been the adventurous instigator, yanking his kid sister along on road trips that once landed me at a weekend music festival with 4 boys and a Sunday visit to a local judge's house to pay a speeding ticket as we raced home on backcountry Pennsylvania roads. How excited I was to be included on this excursion, to hear some very good local bands. I never, though, expected to spend the night outside under the stars as the music kept going and going. We had hardly anything to eat, but enough wine to make me nearly forget the hunger. At some point in the early dawn, a plane flying low overhead dropped parcels of ice cream, and we all lunged for the cardboard cartons. When we finally could return to the car, everyone clamored that they had to get home, fast. When the cop pulled us over, Robert tried to talk him out of writing a ticket, pointing to me, squeezed in the back seat between teenage boys, and saying how urgently I had to be somewhere. Except at the peak of his powers, Robert failed to convince the cop not to issue the ticket. I have a funny story about this whole anecdote with Robert and the trip. One of the guys that was on that trip, Steve Pinson, I did an event at a bookstore in Baltimore in June, and Steve came, which was great. It was great to see him. And at the end of it, he said, Susan, you know, you left out the best part of that. And I'm going, what? What was it? He says, don't you remember what happened when we got to the judge's house? You know, here's this policeman. He leads us to this judge's house. It's like way off some, you know, back road. The judge comes out and he's absolutely a bum. But, you know, we had to pay this judge because the policeman was a policeman. So we paid the judge and went on. But I had forgotten that, which is, you know, the whole idea of memories was a funny thing I had to go through with this book anyway. Although I will say that pretty much everyone that read the book that was in any way part of my life through any of this, pretty much, you know, I didn't do anything egregious that I know of. That hasn't come to me yet. Now, we have a half an hour, and I do often like the discussions. The only other thing I sometimes read, which is my own kind of little breakdown, which was, I ultimately left Rolling Stone magazine to be one of the organizers of 5 nights of No Nukes concerts at Madison Square Garden with Bruce Springsteen, Bonnie Raitt, and everybody else that was around at that time. The concerts were in 1979, and it was 5 nights. And needless to say, for me to like be on, because I had a fairly big role in it all, and for me to be on for 5 nights kind of took it out of me. If I can find it, I could also just tell it to you, which is, you know, I'm just going to tell it to you because it's easier probably to, and I've done enough reading. So anyway, it's 5 nights of concerts. The first night, I confess, I probably did some illicit things, but you know, otherwise, I was fine. You know, I had to be up and about all this time, but I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating. The last night, so the 5th concert, Sam Lovejoy, who is the president of what we called the Muse, Musicians United for Safe Energy, he comes up to me backstage, and somehow Abbie Hoffman's name came up. Now, Abbie Hoffman at the time was underground. I mean, he was a fugitive. And he said something about Abbie. And I'm going, what are you talking about? And he's going, you know, Abbie. I go, I don't know Abbie Hoffman. He goes, yeah, you do. You do know Abbie Hoffman. And it turned out that, in fact, we had given him a desk. I had given him a desk at the Muse office, and he was there. It was Barry Freed. He was selling the Save the River t-shirts, and I had no idea it was Abbie Hoffman. So Sam's telling me this the 5th night of the concerts. I'm burnt out. I'm like burnt to a crisp, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I've been harboring a fugitive. I'm in trouble. you know, definitely they're going to come get me. So, you know, we make it through that concert. There's this big party afterwards. Sam hands me a big check. He's going, you know, this is proceeds from Madison Square Garden. I was the treasurer of this organization. Anyway, so I take this big check to the bank the next day. The bank officer says, this is a lot of money. Don't you think you want to put it in a CD? I'm like, yeah, sure, you know, and I go back and Sam's there, he's going, well, did you deposit the check? I said, yeah, you know, but I put it in a CD. And he's going, you can't do that. We owe that money. That money is all going to pay for, you know, all the expenses. So, you know, I was really out of it at this point. I'm going, all right. So I went back, got the money out of the CD, but then I'm thinking, you know, I think I was having visions that I'm walking down the street and the feds are after me and there's Abby Hoffman. And so I thought, I got to get out of here. So I decide to head to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where my father lived. And I basically get on the train and I'm thinking, okay, I'm okay. But then I had this memory of something very suspicious happening at the Harrisburg. It was then a bus station and a train station. And I thought, oh my God, you know, it was in Jack Kerouac's book On the Road, and there was something that happened. I'm thinking, am I going to get in trouble there? So I get there, and this is probably where my writing works better than my telling it, but it's like, there's the car, lights on. But all of a sudden, the dog, my father was very into dogs, and his oversized poodle was licking his head, had his head outside the window, very excited to see me. And my dad's like, okay, get in the car. So I did, and actually I don't normally read that part afterwards too, but it was my brother that kind of helped me out of that. I mean, he came up, I think my father called my brother and said, you got to come up here, your sister's crazy. And he came up and talked me down, and I was fine. It was just, I think it was just total exhaustion and not eating and stuff like that. So anyway, so this is my favorite part of doing these book events, which is to hear your thoughts and your discussion questions. You can ask me about rock and roll. You can ask me about Abby Hoffman. You can ask, who, by the way, I did get to know Abby Hoffman when he came above board. At a certain point, they let him be Abby Hoffman again. He was actually a very nice person.
Wasn't he for a while in that character when you knew him as before for a number of years?
For a lot of years.
Yeah, for a lot of years. He
was
pretty, like, you know, we're from the New York area, so I remember reading stuff, hearing stuff underground that maybe he was out and about.
Right.
He was pretty visible for being invisible.
Well, I mean, I think most of the people in the office knew it was Abby Hoffman.
Did he like grow a beard? He did something to change his...
He did. I think he had some plastic surgery.
Yeah, he did something to change his beard.
Yeah, he definitely. Yeah, kind of. I think from that up, it was
so
not.
You wouldn't know it was him. Right?
I mean, the eyes were very Abby Hoffman. Yeah.
When I was in high school, I remember that.
Yeah.
So as
Yes, no, so sorry.
As I'm hearing excerpts from your book, it makes me think, wow, is there another book on the horizon? I'm curious.
Yes, I'm doing something on my life with dogs, which is so much fun. After doing this, which was a wrenching experience, because I have a lot of dogs. I've had a lot of dogs in my life, and they each have a story.
Gary Paulson had a children's
Yeah,
book, My Life
I
with
have it.
Dogs.
I have it. Actually, Morgane had me buy that. That was great. Yeah, I have it. It's very good.
Books, you have books. Do you do articles and other things of writing?
Right now, I mean, I wrote articles for so long, and even when I first moved up here, I was still very actively doing articles and essays and whatnot, plus consultant work. But now I'm just doing my own thing.
I don't want to take over all the questions, but do you see yourself staying in Maine forever and ever?
Yeah. Sometimes I don't even want to leave my property. It's that bad.
We're from the New York area. I've been coming here for like 4 years. I was just down there this past weekend, and I don't want to leave my property.
Yeah. So any questions about the?
I don't know anything about Abby Hoffman. I I grew up, I was born in 1950, so I'm kind of in that same era with you. And I relate to the ACEs thing.
Uh-huh,
Adverse
okay.
Childhood experiences, that kind of thing. But, yeah. But who's Abby Hoffman? What did he do? What? I don't know.
Well, he was part of the Chicago Seven. It was seven.
He was part of the Chicago Seven.
Yes.
Tried to stop the Democratic National Convention in 1972.
It was yeah.
And they went on trial. He was also founder of the hippie movement, like precursor of, like they weren't as radicalized as other radical, but they were, with campus protests in the late 60s, early 70s. He was the unofficial student leader at Columbia and all the universities. He was him
Yeah.
and the other guy, Mark.
It sounds like nowadays that wouldn't be a crime.
No, today.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, but back, yeah. So he was the face of it because he was the most vocal. In fact, in the movie, there's a great.
There's a movie on all that
there's a
now.
Great Netflix.
It was very good.
Very good, and that English actor plays it, Sacha Baron Cohen.
Right,
His
yeah.
character.
And Jerry Rubin, I think.
That's what Jerry
And
Rubin-
yeah, see, because what
Sorry,
happened,
Jerry,
yeah, because when I started at Rolling Stone, and actually my partner in crime and getting sort of the no news concerts off the ground was a guy named David Fenton, and David was a high school dropout, and he had gone to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin kind of took him under their wing, and they trained him, and he went on to do all kinds of interesting things. But one day I think I was talking to him about Jerry and Abby, and of course Abby was underground, and he said, "Oh, I got to introduce you to Jerry Rubin. Once you meet him, you won't have any sort of sense of him being some super great guy." I mean, I actually always liked Jerry Rubin. I thought, but by the time I met him, he was more into his yippie stage. He was kind of into, I believe he was married and very, dressed in nice clothes.
Yeah, he went more mainstream.
He went very
He went
mainstream.
corporate.
I mean, Abby never really went mainstream. And then Dave Dillinger was one of the Chicago Seven as well. And he was probably the older of the group that went on trial. And he started a magazine that I briefly interned at before Rolling Stone. And Dave Dillinger was a very nice person.
When I was an elementary teacher and the kids would come in from recess, if there was a scuffle at recess, and they were mad, you go sit there, you write down what's making you so mad. And once they wrote that out, they felt so much better and sometimes even shook hands. Were you released when you wrote this book about all that you learned about your brother?
That's an excellent question. Yes, I think that I was. I think there was so much that I didn't understand, and I was fortunate to have a very good therapist. I did a lot of reading. I had to do a lot of going back myself to my own behaviors over the years, and how much my own behaviors can be traced back to the adverse childhood experiences. It's interesting because I didn't really delve into this until both my parents were deceased. And I think that in a way, I think my mother died considerably after my father, and I think her death kind of freed me to do this in a way too. But yes, I think there was a sense of, and also, since Robert's children are now in their early 40s, and his widow, Charlene, is still somebody that I'm very close to. And I was very careful with the three of them and had them all read it. Although my niece basically all along washed her hands of it and said, "It's your story, Susan. Say it any way you want. I'm fine with that. I'm fine." My nephew read it, had some changes, and I didn't give it to his mother until he suggested some things, which I think were very good suggestions. And then Charlene has been very happy with it. And also, a lot of Robert's friends were at this event that I did in Baltimore. I think people in general, feel glad that I did it. Although I do have a number of cousins that I have not heard from. So I maybe came down a little bit on my family in some ways. For all I know, they just haven't read the book. But. So.
Were there previous books before this one?
Many versions. Well, remember there was the book I sent out that was much more just the rock and roll stuff. And
But that book directly became this book.
yes, but it was a really thorough rewrite. I mean, it wasn't like sitting, some of it got incorporated in this book. There is one chapter in this book that was excerpted too, by the Missouri Review, a pretty good literary magazine. It was the day Elvis dies, and it talks about what it was like to be at Rolling Stone, and then finding out Elvis died and realizing you've got 3 days to put together a whole new magazine. So. But that chapter may have been a leftover from an earlier version. I mean, so there are chapters like that that didn't get changed, but the structure of the book changed very dramatically.
So did your mentor in a way influence your, because your pivot from rock and roll to the rest of the things you do with your life is very dramatic.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you think that trajectory happened?
Well, I think the trajectory happened. I'm not necessarily proud of all the details, but Howard Cohn, who did all the Karen Silkwood stories, I don't know if you remember that, and he did a book, Who Killed Karen. Do you all remember who Karen Silkwood is?
She was the whistleblower for the.
Karen McGee, yeah. Anyway, Rolling Stone was really at the forefront of doing a lot of investigative reporting on what happened to Karen Silkwood. And Howard kind of took me under his wing as well. And I kind of really looked up to him, because I was like 22 or 23 when I got hired. And I sort of thought he was this superstar writer, writing this Karen Silkwood story. So. But anyway, I think they realized fairly early on at Rolling Stone that I didn't really know much about music. So that's why I was working much more with the political reporters. And, Rolling Stone has really always been as much political as musical, even now. I mean, they've always been known pretty much. I mean, I think they've been known for some of their very good journalists. They've had terrific journalists there over the years, so. But it was, there was a certain point after the concerts that I really went back to journalism, very much straight journalism, which most of my career, when you finish up at the Brookings Institution, that's pretty straight, I think. So.
That's like a Jerry Rubin transformation. It's very, very accurate transformation.
Well, not as bad as Jerry. I mean, Jerry was like making money off of it. He was kind of selling his image for, that's my memory. He was sort of selling his image for money.
He was.
And I didn't, yeah. Whereas I think of my transition as much more one of age. And I always retained, I mean, a lot of the work I was doing as a journalist was political, and I felt that was, what I wanted to be doing, and, trying to uncover, never in quite the way Howard Cohn did, but.
When you were at Rolling Stone as a writer, did you interact with producers or people in the industry, not just the performers?
Yeah, I wasn't actually a writer. I was on the editorial
you were in it?
staff.
Okay.
I was on the editorial staff, so
Okay.
I was more kind of a lackey. I mean, I got to write some stuff, but not very much.
Okay.
But they did call us editorial staff, which was nice, and it was a great job. I got to know a lot of people in the music industry in that period of time. Like Tom Freston, who went on to found one of the founders of MTV and stuff. He was around quite a bit. And also when I was doing a lot of the organizing, because before I did the No Nukes concerts, I did a concert to raise money for the Karen Silkwood case. And I started it out as a cocktail fundraising party that would be sponsored by Rolling Stone. And what happened was Bonnie Raitt's manager called and said, Bonnie wants to do a concert. And I, being naive, I'm like, oh, she wants to perform at the cocktail party? Because she wasn't really much back then. I mean, this is, what, 76, 77. And anyway, to make a long story short, I did actually somehow pull off doing a concert. And James Taylor and Carly Simon performed with her. So it was a sold-out concert, and it was nice. But, you know, I mean, again, I kind of, in retrospect, and I think that's what comes across in the book, I didn't know what I was doing. I was just doing it, you know, I just, you know, but anyway, when I did that concert especially, I had to find places for an after party, because every time I turned around, Bonnie's manager would call me with another Bonnie demand, you know, well, she'll do it if you can sell a certain amount of tickets at double the price, which I did. Well, but to do that, you had to have an after party. So I, you know, found some of the local nightclubs and spent time there and got someone to agree to sponsor our parties.
Doesn't sound like my life.
It was fun. It was fun. It was. But you know, at this point in my life, I like to kind of wake up in the morning not thinking about what I have to do. You know, I can look out at the water, and the only thing I have to do very early, maybe too early in the morning, is walk my puppy. But, you know, again, it's not, I think a lot of the stuff I was doing in those years, those New York years, were, I mean, partly because I was young and, you know, everything was very new and I wasn't experienced, but, you know, it was exciting, but it was also really hard. You know, it was almost as much fun as it was kind of stressful. But I wouldn't trade it in, though.
I wonder if you should visit colleges and folks going into journalism and just share some of what you've been through. I don't know, I think it'd be interesting for them.
Well, I did teach journalism. I taught at American University. I taught at Georgetown, not Georgetown, George Washington too, but I taught composition there. But I love teaching journalism. You know, I've tried to get some of the area schools to hire me, but they won't. Maybe I didn't try that hard. You know, I mean, the problem with the whole academic system is that, you know, when they're looking for somebody to come in a more adjunct position, they still want, which is what I was for a while in Washington, you know, they want somebody young, somebody that can potentially become a full professor. The other thing too is I have my master's, I don't have my MFA. And that, even when I was teaching at AU and GW, and I kind of was feeling out whether they might hire me, they said, you know, you don't have a terminal degree. And I tried to make the whole argument that Hunter Thompson always called himself Dr. Hunter Thompson, but they didn't buy that.
Did you get to know him at Rolling Stone?
I did. That was actually, I liked Hunter. He was, you know, he was every bit as much the character as you would expect. I mean, there's nothing disappointing about him. He really would, you know, one of my favorite things that I had to, well, it's not my favorite, but it was sort of funny. He liked to stay at what was the Paris Hilton, the Paris Hotel, right, Rolling Stone's offices at that point were on Central Park, and across the street was this very Plaza, the Plaza Hotel. I don't know why I said, of course, the Plaza. So he liked to stay at the Plaza. And one time he was coming in from Colorado, and Iris, somebody that I work with, said, would you mind running over to the Plaza Hotel and giving them all this cash? I said, why am I giving them all this cash? It turned out that the last time Hunter stayed there, he took out his gun and shot out every light bulb in his hotel room. So they said, he can stay here, but you're giving us a full deposit in cash. But yeah, he was definitely, and he was also, I mean, his physical presence, you know, he was a tall guy and he was pretty much in very good shape. I mean, he just looked like exactly what you would imagine. There was nothing disappointing about him. You know, I mean, I'm sorry that he took his life in the end too, obviously. And they were clearly, and I felt bad for the editors that had to work with him because it was very hard to get him to actually turn stuff in on time. Actually, the last time I was in this building, when I was taking one of the classes that the Maine Writers and Publishers does, and the guy who was running that workshop had written a book on Hunter Thompson, which I have at home. A lot of people have written about Hunter. Well, you're an interesting group because usually I get more people asking me about the trauma and the childhood trauma. So it's nice to be talking more rock and roll and Hunter Thompson and Abby Hoffman and stuff.
Well, I wanted to get into that, and I thought, no, we won't.
Well, I would be interested in what you have to say about it, but.
I got this piece of mail that I looked at yesterday. It's a new book for women.
Mm-hmm.
And it was talking about, I'm not going to get it exactly right, the words right, but something about like non-lethal strangulation. They were talking about domestic abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And and that happened to me on my job.
Mm-hmm.
I had a guy who, I worked at a hospital, and he would take the traction rope and make nooses out of it.
Mm.
Uh-huh. And we worked 3 to 11 shifts. There's not a lot of people around in this little hospital.
Right.
In Lakewood, Florida. And, you know, he'd hang them from the ceiling, you know, with hooks and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure he had it around my neck once.
That's kind of spooky.
Yeah. And that's as I was an adult, and I was just so clueless. I'm pretty clueless about a lot of stuff. A lot of people you talk about today don't know. Anyway, yeah, interesting. And one of the things that I picked up on in the reading that about this new book for women was taking and creating like a scenario, like, you know, the man is saying thus and such to a woman, and it's like a veiled threat underneath, or oh, you probably shouldn't do that because blah blah blah. You know, it doesn't even sound like domestic abuse to what I would think.
Right.
I'm thinking domestic abuse is just, I'm going to hit you.
Yeah. Just, I hate to stop you, but really the whole idea of adverse childhood experiences, I mean, it might lead ultimately to somebody exhibiting domestic violence when they grow up. That might be, but I don't tend to think of them exactly in the same slot, but I could be wrong. I mean, I'm not the therapist or psychiatrist, but.
I think it leads you to what you think is acceptable and not an adverse.
Okay, so that's what I was saying, it could lead.
My opinion of adverse childhood experiences is if something happened to you, so you think something's acceptable when it really shouldn't have been.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And
And then
the kinds of
recognizing
things,
that when you're in
the
the
kinds of
future.
things that my father said to me when I was a kid, you know, I'm thinking that that's domestic abuse. And that piece of mail I got kind of opened that up for me. Um, So, I wondered, what would I have been like if I hadn't had those parents? What would I have been like?
Well, really for those of us growing up in the 50s or before, or even into the early 60s, I mean, our parents didn't know. They hadn't, and I say that, but I think that there are a lot of people out there that are raising children that just that have no interest in understanding that the way they treat their children could have serious ramifications as they become adults. So, I don't think our realization of what happens to children that are abused or traumatized, because I certainly don't think Robert and I were abused, but we were very much traumatized. But I think there's still plenty of parents out there that don't care. But of course, that's a whole nother discussion and a whole nother book.
Yeah, see, that's why I didn't.
That's fine. No, I think it was great. Any more questions? Last questions? It's getting to be toward the end. Did our Zoom people ever come on?
We do have one, but she had nothing.
Oh, okay. Great.
I think you're probably selling the book.
I am, and I forgot to bring a pen if somebody wants me, great. So